It's my Nerd World. Welcome. A Star Wars podcast, and we got a lot to get to this week. We will start off with the rumor mill. We have a new animated show that's being rumored. You may or may not be interested, depending on your level of excitement for this content that we're about to receive. Plus, we have a lot of news to dive into. Mandalorian has really been helping out Disney Plus with their new subscriptions and streaming, and it has a lot to do with people going and watching Rebels and Clone Wars, and so we'll get into that. Rosario Dawson talks about her live-action portrayal of Ahsoka in last week's episode, which I got totally wrong, by the way. I called it Chapter 14 last week, and it was Chapter 13. That was totally my bad. This week was Chapter 14. Speaking of Chapter 14, we got a lot of ground to cover. That was quite the episode. Robert Rodriguez, the director, talks about how he wasn't supposed to direct this week's episode, and we'll tell you why. I'll give you my spoiler review of Mandalorian Episode 14 and everything that ended up happening in that very short episode. It was fantastic, though. Plus, new mythology. We're finally getting what I was wanting all along with this TV show, and that is a lot of meat on the mythological Force Star Wars bones. Plus, listener feedback. All right, let's go ahead and get to it. It is brought to you by mynerdworld.net, where you can find out about everything as it relates to My Nerd World, the podcast that I do through My Nerd World, and, of course, the EMBARK science fiction space opera series available right now at Amazon.com.
It's an instinct. A feeling. Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited. And now, you're coming together. Is your undoing.
Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny. The Force will be with you.
Always.
My Nerd World.
Are episodes 7, 8, and 9, do they fall into the category of Christmas movies? They do for me, and I've got a broad sort of definition of what is and what isn't a Christmas movie. Often I'll kind of zero in on a film. If it takes place during Christmas time, it's a Christmas movie. Lethal Weapon, Iron Man 3 specifically. Star Wars, however, and the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens, Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker, all having been released around Christmas time, and all the promotion, the major portion of the promotion taking place during the holidays. Oh, I guess including Rogue One as well. All the films fall into that Christmas category for me. Even though I can watch them year-round and not think of Christmas, I can't help but get into the Christmas season now ever since The Force Awakens, and going and watching any number of these films, if not all of these films, at some point during the Christmas season just evokes those types of feelings. And again, it made me, the intro made me think about that, because as the intro was playing and the trailer was playing, I suddenly got this rush of nostalgic Christmas vibes. I am Jon Justice, and this is My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. I'm really glad you're with the show this week. We have a lot to get to, and going to be doing a little bit of format changing. You may not even have noticed if I hadn't mentioned anything, but I'm going to make things with the show a little bit more detailed in terms of how we're going to cover the show every single week, depending on the news that we have. So, for example, this week we are going to kick off with the rumor mill and some interesting tidbits that have been leaked by a fairly reputable organization.
This is not going to go the way you think.
Now, this comes from Cinelinx, and I put this in sort of the outer rim news, right? We're going to have regular news coming up, and then we'll dive into the main topic of the show and listener feedback as we kind of break up the show into different segments moving forward. And I file this under outer rim news, and what I mean by that is I'm not exactly sure of its validity, but it's definitely worth mentioning. So this comes from Cinelinx. I haven't heard a lot negative, much negativity said about Cinelinx, but this was a rather interesting rumor that came out, and I wanted to share it with you on this week's show. So Star Wars animated projects are still in the works, and we've heard this for a while, and we've heard word that one of them will let fans experience the High Republic, which is kicking into high gear. We're getting a lot of information about the release of these books coming up very soon, of which I am very curious to check out, even if I'm not overly hyped for them. I've talked about this at length on previous shows. The article goes on to say, over the last couple of days, I've heard from a handful of sources that 3 new animated series are currently in various stages of development, one of which would be set during the High Republic era. This January, Lucasfilm and Disney are kicking off a new publishing initiative that ushers in a new unexplored period of time in Star Wars, being set a couple hundred years before the events of the films, specifically Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, opens up a wide range of storytelling potential, and I'm already in love with it, according to the author of the article. From what I've heard, this is definitely among their new sandboxes to play in for stories. Despite being initially announced as a publishing project, doing nothing with my fingers, I've heard even last year it was being considered as a multimedia project that would span other mediums as well. It's already popped up in VR, and this actually isn't the first time that I've heard the High Republic mentioned in terms of a TV show. I've had whispers of a potential live-action series happening as well, but I'm not sure if that's still in the cards or some wires got crossed and it was always about an animated project. We'll get a little bit more into this later on in this week's show, as it specifically relates to timelines and how new Star Wars content is handling timelines. There was a very interesting little nugget that Dave Filoni put out in the wake of Episode 13, of which Ahsoka appeared, that ends a little bit of speculation about the Rebels timeline and also opens up the possibility of what we will most likely be seeing, at least in my opinion, of a live-action Ahsoka series. Getting back to this article about the High Republic animated series, it goes on to say, still not entirely sure what the other animated project is. Could be the long-rumored Rebels follow-up, but to be honest, it's been a while since I've heard anything regarding that. With Ahsoka now in live action, I'm not sure that's going to happen with that particular story. Now, it may seem odd, me being an author, got more books in the works, that I'm not all that thrilled about this particular time period. But to be honest, the High Republic and sort of the mythology of the glory days of the Jedi, of what this lays out, just isn't, a part of the Star Wars universe that I immediately gravitate towards. I could end up changing my opinion. I do plan on checking out some of these books. And I'm, what I meant to say was, it's funny being that I'm an author that I'm not all that thrilled about new books being released, but it's really more just about the particular time period of which they've chosen. But I'm definitely keeping an open mind. It is Star Wars after all, and there isn't anything of Star Wars I don't love. It's just some things I love more than others. I am excited, though, about the fact that perhaps we are getting some animated series out of this. And as we'll get into a little bit later on into the news, with Disney Plus performing so well with their Star Wars content and the need for more Star Wars content, that makes a whole lot of sense. As with everything that we cover on the show, if you want to comment at any point, leave a comment up on YouTube or email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
All right, let's dive into quite a bit of news this week, including this announcement being made on StarWars.com. 2021 marks the 50th anniversary of Lucasfilm. The celebration will kick off with commemorative fan favorite 50th anniversary Star Wars products. The launch will start in January and will continue throughout the year with special edition product releases. According to Paul Southern, Lucasfilm Senior Vice President of Licensing and Franchise, he says, to commemorate Lucasfilm's 50 years of storytelling, we look forward to honoring this consumer product's legacy and bringing to life brand new products, games, publishing offerings that celebrate our future with Lucasfilm's exciting feature films and Disney Plus series ahead. I'm excited to see what they have to offer with this. I gravitate more towards the toy lines that represent the sort of one-to-one versions of what we see in the storytelling content. So when we get commemorative action figures that are done all in gold, or they have a carbonized series out right now of Mandalorian Black Series figures. I ended up getting one because I really love the Cara Dune one, and I want to support Gina Carano. But that being said, I usually gravitate towards that which is more on screen, whether it's big screen or little screen, accurate. I have been pleased with the toy rollout that they've been doing, especially if you haven't seen. There is going to be a wave of 3 3/4 5 points of articulation action figures. So these would be action figures that are more in line with what we traditionally would always get with Star Wars film releases. Hasbro has been defaulting to the vintage line, which is for the 3 3/4 figures, those are more articulated figures that cost quite a bit more. We are getting a wave, though, like I said, of the more traditional standard action figures. And that was one of the biggest things that bummed me out with the merchandising rollout for The Rise of Skywalker, is that they didn't complete the series of action figures that we always got for all of the saga films with The Rise of Skywalker. They got rid of that standard 5 POA line in favor of the vintage series. And because of that, they really reduced the number of figures that we got, understandably so, because they weren't selling. I mean, that reduction started with The Last Jedi. I think they saw the sales when it came to The Force Awakens, and they realized how much the market had changed, which makes sense. I mean, the people that are buying the majority of the Star Wars toys now and collecting are older guys like me, and women, as opposed to when we were younger. We all clamored for Star Wars toys because we didn't have the ability to watch the films over and over again like we do now. So the consumer demand for Star Wars toys has changed, dramatically over the course of the past 45, 50 years. And I understand the need to make sure that they cater to the market specifically so they don't end up wasting money. Hasbro with their vehicle line and their vintage vehicle line, these are more detailed vehicles for their more detailed vintage series figures that run quite a bit more money. To the point where we even have a HasLab where if they get enough people to sign up for a particular vehicle, for example, then they'll go ahead and create that vehicle, of which they've done with the Razor Crest. What I wish they would do, and what I'm hoping they do, is with the release of these standard 3 3/4 inch 5 POA figures, that they would make some vehicles that are movie accurate, but also not as articulate, so the price point can be better. I love my vehicles, and I miss the fact that we just don't get the vehicles we normally get, especially for The Rise of Skywalker. I mean, there were so many different vehicles, especially Kylo Ren's TIE Whisper, that I desperately would love to have an action figure size version for that we just didn't get. And so and they're just molds. That's the part of it that kind of drives me nuts. We're just talking about molds. You don't have to add all the intricate details. You can give it more flimsy landing gear. I'm cool with that. The majority of fans are. That being said, I was really worried for a while that the toy lines were going to slow down quite a bit. And at least we've seen with The Mandalorian, that's not the case. It'll just be fascinating to see if they're actually figuring out exactly what the market demands are. And again, with sort of that classic wave of figures that has a lower price point, perhaps we will begin to get some of those lower price point, but still screen big or little accurate versions of vehicles. That's what I'm hoping for. But it'll be interesting to see what they end up rolling out for the 50th anniversary, and hopefully we'll get some of the action figures that we didn't get for The Rise of Skywalker. All right, this article comes from The Verge as we continue with our news portion of My Nerd World of Star Wars podcast. The Mandalorian second season is more than halfway done now, right? What's become more apparent, this article's a week old, as the show goes on, is how much it relies on Star Wars The Clone Wars. And what's interesting about this, too, is that it's not just Star Wars The Clone Wars that Mandalorian has been sort of leaning on as, and this is going to be a full spoiler episode, by the way, but as demonstrated in one of the shortest episodes, but one of the craziest and action-packed episodes so far in Chapter 14, The Tragedy, is that we're actually getting a lot of prequel references, and I dig that, especially with some of the dialogue and the body language, specifically the twirling of the pistol that Boba Fett does in the episode. Both the dialogue portion, a simple man trying to make his way in the galaxy, and the pistol flip, the pistol spin, were direct callbacks going back to Attack of the Clones. The Verge article goes on to say audiences turning to Clone Wars as a way to better understand what's happening in The Mandalorian or refresh their memories makes sense. But the spike in Clone Wars viewership has an even bigger winner, and that's Disney+. The Mandalorian has caused jumps in Clone Wars views before. When The Mandalorian first came out in November of 2019, Clone Wars saw its first massive spike. Interest remained high until the second spike in the spring of 2020, when the 7th season of Clone Wars was released on Disney+. It dropped after that, but the show saw a third spike occupying The Mandalorian second season premiere in October. It's been trending ever since, according to an analytics firm. When looking at the data from January 1st of 2017 to present day, the team's researchers found that by the end of 2019, Clone Wars saw a level of demand from U.S. audiences that is many factors greater than anything it experienced before. To put that into context, Clone Wars now, a year after The Mandalorian debuted, is over 4 times as popular as it was before the live-action series came around. And while data for Star Wars Rebels wasn't provided, Google Trends show a similar spike in interest for the show over the last week, which is likely due to the big Admiral Thrawn reveal at the end of the Jedi episode, Chapter 13. Now, this makes sense. People sign up for or sign into Disney Plus to watch wonderful adventures of Grogu, right? Okay. And then spend the next several weeks making their way through Clone Wars. For Disney, it's the best possible outcome. An October report found that daily usage on Disney Plus had declined over the last 6 months. There have been spikes in viewership. Hamilton brought in a number of subscribers and convinced people who wouldn't sign up for Disney Plus to do just that. But getting people to use the platform every single day was getting tougher. Now, without being able to flood the streamer with TV shows and film, as competitors like Netflix, Disney Plus has to rely on opportunities to grow. The uptick in Clone Wars viewership and interest helps solve part of that problem. The Mandalorian pushes more people every single week to check out the Clone Wars, a show with 7 seasons, which in turn might encourage fans to revisit 1 or 2 of the main Skywalker saga movies. And look, I can just speak for me personally, as an uber Star Wars fan that's done hundreds of podcasts every single week for the past, almost 5 years now. I can tell you that when I watch these episodes and I see nods to films or speculation that leads me down a rabbit hole to a particular film, I don't care what film it is, I generally have a desire to go watch those movies. And even though I have all the Blu-rays, often I find myself sitting there going, I'm just going to go into Disney Plus, especially when it comes to the original trilogy, because those 4K transfers are spectacular. So this makes all the sense in the world. Even for a hardcore fan that watches these films all the time, this is having a similar impact for individuals that are just casual fans or new fans. The interconnected universe is something the Star Wars fans deep into the universe's lore want more of, and provides Disney with the perfect opportunity to keep people on the platform when they're done with an episode of The Mandalorian. With a number of live-action and animated series ordered for Disney+, that universe becomes a bigger web that Disney can keep spinning as fans, old and new, remain invested in the bigger Star Wars story. Clearly, Clone Wars and Rebel creator Dave Filoni, the executive producer on The Mandalorian, right, is writing The Mandalorian into his more expansive Star Wars universe. It's a good thing for fans of the live-action series. The show has never been better, and as a new fan of Clone Wars, the article writer writes, I love catching up with the show I've put off for so long. But the newfound and renewed interest is also a major win for Disney in its effort to find a way to steal people's attention away from streamers like Netflix and, more importantly, keep it. We also have some news, and I don't have it extensively covered in the show this week, but there has been quite a bit of news coming out, and even behind-the-scenes set photos from the production of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, which apparently is going to be doing some filming in Boston. There's a lot of speculation that perhaps they've built a volume stage, which is the same stage they filmed The Mandalorian on in Boston. But also, Diego Luna recently did an interview, and he talked about how the Cassian Andor series has already begun filming. Look, all of this is great news for Disney fans. HBO dropped a bombshell this week that, I guess it would be Warner Brothers, right? All of the Warner Brothers HBO, all the Warner Brothers slate of films are going to come out on HBO Max this year for a month at the same time they're released in theaters. I mean, we're talking Godzilla vs. Kong, Dune, Wonder Woman. The list goes on and on. We don't know what the future of the movie-going experience is going to be. If I had to guess, I think the multiplexes are gone. At least they're going to be gone for a while. I think what we're going to see is, once we get through this ridiculously stupid pandemic, what we're going to see is that we'll have a return to the days of the massive movie theater that had like 2 screens. I think of the Cinerama Dome in Los Angeles, and right as I was sort of growing up, before we got the multiplexes, before the eruption of the mall movie theater, we had movie theaters that really, the Man's Chinese Theater in Hollywood is probably a better example I can give. I think we'll end up seeing a return to that. When you think about this real estate that's been holding all of these, that houses all these multiplexes around the country, they're going to start going under because of what's happened with this pandemic. And you're going to have one or two things happen. You're going to have these empty theaters, and then these different movie companies like AMC, Regal, Cinemark, they're going to struggle if they're able to maintain structure. But those movie theaters are going to go empty, and they're either going to be plowed over by developers who buy the property and put something else up there, or perhaps another movie company emerges, but I just don't see the multiplex coming back anytime soon. And with this bombshell coming of all these slates of this slate of movies coming out from HBO, I imagine that we're going to be hearing very similar things coming from Disney. As a matter of fact, they've already sort of telegraphed this in the most recent earnings call, and I know we get another one next week. They talked about how their focus is going to be on Disney+. All of this is good news for us as Star Wars fans because we're going to be getting a lot of Star Wars content on Disney+. It's bad news for those of us like myself that really, truly believe that the Star Wars experience is best served on the big screen. Considering the fact that we're not going to be getting a live-action feature film slated until 2023, I have some confidence that we'll be able to go to a theater then, not having to worry about this pandemic anymore before then. But between now and then, it looks like it's all going to be on Disney+. All right, moving forward, Rosario Dawson did a lengthy interview with Star Wars, StarWars.com. I'm not going to read to you the whole thing, but I am going to give you some highlights from it. Really interesting stuff. The article says this, kind of a Q&A. For Rosario Dawson, there's only one way to explain her casting as Ahsoka Tano. She tells StarWars.com, I think it definitely was the Force at work. And she might be right. In February of 2017, a Star Wars fan tweeted at Dawson, asking if she would ever want to play the fan favorite Jedi, who, at that point, had only been seen in the animated series Star Wars: The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels. To the surprise of pretty much everyone, Dawson responded emphatically, yes please, with the hashtags Ahsoka Lives, Ahsoka Tano, and Star Wars. Now, the internet took notice, causing a stir within the fan community about the possibility of Ahsoka making the jump to live action. Dawson's enthusiasm only added to that excitement. Well, Lucasfilm noticed too. I think someone who does the press for Star Wars saw it and forwarded it to the Ahsoka creator and Mandalorian executive producer, Dave Filoni, who said, interesting, yeah, she looks like she could be her. That's cool. He then followed me on Twitter, Dawson says. They ended up having the Star Wars account follow me, and that became a whole thing. Like, wait, did that just happen? I got really excited. And then nothing happened. She left. Nothing happened for a long time. When I spoke with Dave about it, and they started talking about doing this show, and he did the math of what year it was, he kind of revisited that idea of me for the character, and with my age versus where she would be, and said, this is actually a feasible thing. Now, according to Dawson, Favreau and Filoni did not want to bring Ahsoka into Season 1, but as it started going along, it was always sort of a thing in the back of Filoni's mind. Dave had always wanted to continue her story and give her a chance at live action. And there was one more bit of Force-related serendipity, and this explains a photograph that's been going around quite a bit on the internet for a while, and now we know where it came from. I'm kind of ashamed I didn't know before. Ahsoka Tano began her career as Anakin Skywalker's Padawan learner. Snips and Sky Guy, right? That's what annoyed everybody. As it turns out, Dawson attended the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute and later appeared in Shattered Glass with one Hayden Christensen, who played, of course, Anakin in the Star Wars prequels. I have to say for Dave, going online and looking up things, when he came across the photo of the two of us hugging each other, he lost it. He said, how is this? This is meant to be. Now, as revealed by her tweet confirming her interest in the role, Dawson had been a fan of the Clone Wars, watching it with her daughter. And once she was on board to play Ahsoka, the actor dove back into Clone Wars, Star Wars Rebels, and the saga at large to prepare. There was so much material to work with. I think that was definitely a huge benefit for me. I was marathoning the show from beginning to end, putting in the movies, she said. It was really fun to see how Ahsoka's physicality changed, and her facial expressions changed, and her voice and her tenor changed as she just evolved. Now, by the way, she does spend quite a bit of time in this article talking about Ashley Eckstein. I simply chose to gloss over that for the sake of time. If you want to check out what she had to say, which was nothing but positive, make sure you go to StarWars.com and take a look at the interview for yourself. In addition to some surprising guidance from Dave Filoni, who pointed to the Lord of the Rings Gandalf as a touch point for the character, she went on to say, it was just interesting playing with an amalgamation of all that. I wanted to kind of have some of her playfulness and in turn, the cocky eyebrow thing that she does. You know, she's got that feistiness. You know she's willing to push the rules a little bit in order to get what she needs to get done. But I also really like that she does have that wisdom. She's gone through a lot. She's really gone through a lot of things. She's grounded more than when you first meet her as a young teen. It was really fun to find moments to throw homages to different aspects of Ahsoka that I always loved. Now, Filoni directed and wrote The Jedi, clearly a personal effort for him as he shepherded Ahsoka from the beginning. As Filoni told Dawson, she's sort of been wandering, if you know Dave. Then he's got a classic samurai references. He was talking about films like Yojimbo. She's wandering the galaxy, helping those in need. To the actor that fits with her interpretation of the character, she always, for me, was a true Jedi, even if she technically wasn't a Jedi anymore. She represented the best of what the Jedi Order could be. For Dawson, one of the most memorable moments was when the part truly became real. Costume fitting. I've got pictures and video. I was jumping up and down as if I was jumping rope, she said. I was so excited. Dawson was determined to be authentic to Ahsoka's animated look as possible, and to her mind, it came together with one distinct feature. There was a point, actually, where Dave was curious whether I should wear contacts or not. I had tried them on, so I knew what a difference it made. Also, in talking about the fans, I was like, you can't do this to me. I can't not have blue eyes. That will just not be okay. And it really made all the difference because, you know, you have to have the whole headpiece and the costume and the whole world because we're there on set. It's incredible with these huge screens. You feel like all of it's there. You've got lightsabers, but the contacts would go in, and I just dropped into this character. I wasn't Rosario playing dress-up cosplay. I was Ahsoka. Now, you know that she's not so much showing up as a cameo, the article goes on to say, but really being a storytelling device for new fans that have fallen in love with yet another new character that we're getting to see grow. Little Grogu is just amazing. Okay, that actually was a quote from Rosario. My apologies. So when Dawson speaks with StarWars.com, it was just 2 days before the premiere of Chapter 13, The Jedi. She admits to being anxious about her performance and its reception, and maybe that's because Dawson, in the end, still an Ahsoka fan, is the same person who answered the random tweet about somehow taking the role. And just a fascinating story. And I know some people have called that a bit into question. But given that goes all the way back to 2017, I do tend to sort of lean on the fact that actually legitimately is how this whole thing played out. And listen, as somebody who works in the, with my fingers, entertainment industry, I can tell you firsthand that after 25 years of doing radio, often it is just about networking. I mean, I guess that goes with any sort of business, but especially within entertainment, right? You know, you've got to strike a chord with individuals. A resume often isn't just enough. You've got to be able to sort of go beyond that, and really, especially with, I can only imagine, something like a Star Wars character that is so crucial to get right. It's connections like this, and it's those personal relationships and the actress or actor's desire to play a certain character that's going to go a long way in an individual going in and landing that role. I'll address this a little bit further in listener feedback coming up, but someone did make a comment about her leku, right? Being too short or different. One of the costume designers on The Mandalorian tweeted shortly after last week's episode and after I posted up the podcast that they actually had to shorten those because of the body movements for the actual character. So they spent a lot of time making sure that Rosario Dawson looked as much like Ahsoka Tano that we were all used to seeing, but at the same time, they had to have the functionality for her or the stunt double to be able to go and perform those particular stunts that she needed to do, which is why the leku that she has looks different. And for those that don't know, that's the long extension off of her hair, with the blue stripes and the white. Okay. Now, one more item on this, and then we'll move over to this week's episode, right? Chapter 14, The Tragedy, which I have a lot to talk about with that. From Vanity Fair, there was an interesting article that was they were interviewing Dave Filoni, and they asked a question with regard to the mention of Grand Admiral Thrawn, Ahsoka searching for him. For those of us that have watched Rebels, you know what I'm talking about. The quest that Ahsoka is on, according to Vanity Fair, is the search for the villain Grand Admiral Thrawn. The last time that they saw Ahsoka, the fans saw Ahsoka, was this spring's finale of the Clone Wars, right? But in the actual Star Wars chronology, right, the last time that we saw her venturing off with Sabine Wren to find Ezra Bridger was actually the last time that we saw her chronologically, right? Where does that scene at the end of the Clone Wars fit with where we find her in The Mandalorian? Okay, so let me give you the backdrop here, because that was really wonky. Part of my page was cut off, which was part of the issue. So the last time we saw fresh Ahsoka content, apart from last week's Chapter 13, was the last season of the Clone Wars that we got. Now, that took place pre-Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Chronologically, the last time that we saw Ahsoka was the epilogue in the Rebels finale that took place directly after the events of Return of the Jedi. The Mandalorian takes place 5 years after those events from Return of the Jedi. So in that particular scene at the end of Rebels, spoiler alert, you have Ahsoka, as I mentioned on last week's show, and on a lengthy blog that I put up on mynerdworld.net earlier this week, which I would encourage you to go and check out, where I talk at length about my opinion of how Rosario Dawson did, which was all thumbs up positive. We saw Ahsoka arriving on a planet to, speculating, but to pick up Sabine so that the two of them can head off to go find Grand Admiral Thrawn, and more specifically the Jedi in training Ezra Bridger. So this caused a little bit of confusion in this fan and a lot of people's, minds because of the timeline. So if we saw her meeting with Sabine to go find Thrawn, and then we move forward 5 years and she meets the Mandalorian and she's still looking for Thrawn, what's the deal? She's been spending 5 years looking for Thrawn? Nope. Because we're not looking at it linear when it comes to Rebels and the Mandalorian, and this is what Dave Filoni had to say. He says, that's not necessarily chronological. I think the thing that people will most not understand is they want everything, the content, to go in chronological fashion. But as I learned as a kid, nothing in Star Wars really works that way. You do episodes 4, 5, and 6, and then you do 1, 2, and 3, and then you do 7, 8, and 9. If you look at the epilogue of Rebels, right, you don't know how much time has passed, so it's possible that the story I'm telling in The Mandalorian actually takes place prior to that. So, look, in my opinion, Dave Filoni is not going to go and make that comment unless that actually indeed is the case. And in this case, I believe that what we thought was the epilogue of Rebels taking place right after Return of the Jedi, pre the 5 years that The Mandalorian starts, is not true. The epilogue of Ahsoka arriving with Sabine at the end of Rebels actually takes place past The Mandalorian and past the episode that we got for Ahsoka, which means that we could end up seeing a live-action version of that, and this is how I imagine that can go down. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into our talk about episode 14 this week, but as a bit of a preview, I can imagine it going like this. She has the fight with the magistrate, okay, in the episode last week, and she's trying to find out where Thrawn is, and let's just say conceivably she found out where Thrawn is. Now we get to a point where perhaps they launch a live-action Ahsoka show, and the live-action Ahsoka show starts with Ahsoka arriving wherever Sabine is, now with the knowledge of where she believes Grand Admiral Thrawn is, and then we launch our live-action TV show. I don't know if that's the case, but I love the fact that, as I've said, we've now got mythology to go and chew on, and that's a good thing. That's what The Mandalorian needed to do. And as I mentioned last week with listener feedback, I don't have any problem with the introduction of all these characters. It's still the Mandalorian story. And for me personally, it doesn't make the universe any smaller. What we're doing is we're putting out these feelers. We're putting out these potential connected threads so that we can begin to tell stories. And the Mandalorian is the jump off point for that. And I personally am absolutely 100% okay with that. All right, we have reached that portion of the show. It is time to get into this week's episode of The Mandalorian, Chapter 14, because I got it wrong last week, The Tragedy.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
So let's first start off with its director. I had completely forgotten that Robert Rodriguez was going to be directing this video. And I mean, this particular episode. Now, Robert Rodriguez is a director that, like, I don't necessarily get excited over Robert Rodriguez's projects, but I often enjoy them. Okay. You go back to, Planet Terror with, and From Dusk Till Dawn with Quentin Tarantino. You go to Alita Battle Angel. He's done the Spy Kids movies. There is a definite kinetic energy that Robert Rodriguez brings to his directing style. That was clearly apparent in this Mandalorian episode, and it worked for me, if only because the episode was short. I do have a few nitpicks to get into with this week's episode. Not big stuff, but it's more things related to Robert Rodriguez directing this episode than it is the episode in and of itself, and I'll explain. Don't misunderstand. I still enjoyed this episode immensely. Every single chapter in this season, I have honestly enjoyed more than Season 1, and I love Season 1. Robert Rodriguez apparently was not supposed to be the director for this episode, and this article comes from Games Radar. The man behind the camera, Robert Rodriguez, was initially not meant to be directing the stunning half hour of television. He said, "I'm friends with Jon Favreau, and he needed a last-minute replacement for a director," Rodriguez tells SFX while promoting his new Netflix movie, We Can Be Heroes. And so I said, sure, I'll come play in the Star Wars universe. What a dream. And it's it's beyond my expectations. I mean, it was so fun. You can't imagine what it's like to walk on the set that has the classic look of The Empire Strikes Back. It's right after that era, right after Return of the Jedi. It's that era. So you really feel like you just walked into your childhood. Now, the episode featured more than a handful of nods to The Empire Strikes Back. Rodriguez also went on to discuss working with Pedro Pascal, who leads The Mandalorian alongside Grogu, and who also appears in the Netflix movie We Can Be Heroes. I actually filmed this movie before I worked on it with him on the Mandalorian, the director says. So I was surprised to go to the set and say, "Hey, you're here too." So it's fun working with him. He was terrific in the movie and fun to work with. Okay, so this was a crazy episode. And as I do when talking about these episodes, I'm not going to go shot by shot and scene by scene. I'm just going to kind of give you my overall feel of it and kind of where we are. I'll start off with some nitpicks. I felt that the dialogue of the Mandalorian in this episode was weird. Like, it was wordy Mando, and it seemed like a departure from the opening shot. And I enjoyed the scenes, don't misunderstand, but from the opening shot inside of the Razor Crest when he tests Grogu again using the little ball that sits off top of that silver handle inside of the cockpit. And the discussion that he was having and how vocal he was. I mean, I suppose the Mandalorian's been talking more than he was in season 1, but it just seemed like suddenly now we got chatty Mando, and that kind of threw me off. And the cold open was probably, while this episode was great, I thought the cold open to this before we get to dun and the Mandalorian logo was one of the least impactful. And it may be different for other people. It's just my opinion. I mean, him talking to Grogu and how he's going to find the people that he needs, and then we end up with the logo and the musical cue. I don't know. It just felt a little flat to me. And again, Rodriguez has a very distinct style that I'm kind of 50-50 on. In my mind, Robert Rodriguez is most known to me as having really janky CGI work. He just likes to use a lot of CGI, and even though Alita Battle Angel is a movie that I enjoy immensely, and they had to do a lot of really intricate and difficult CGI work in there, it definitely had that style of Robert Rodriguez, where at some point he kind of throws caution to the wind and just says, go with it. And if you watch the episode closely, you can see some really wonky CGI of stormtroopers running over rocks and stuff. But it was just so typical Robert Rodriguez. It wasn't anything that ruined the episode for me or took me out. It's just more of an observation. All right, on a positive note, holy cow, this was a fun episode, right? And little details that Rodriguez captured. I'm going to give him a lot of credit, right? And again, this is where I go 50-50 on Robert Rodriguez. For example, when the Razor Crest is approaching the top of the little temple mount, and he banks the Razor Crest sideways, and you get Grogu in there leaning because he's feeling the G's of what the Razor Crest is doing. I love my vehicles. I love my flight. I love my flight sequences, and that was just a nice little nod and detail that I enjoyed. The fact that he says, I don't have anywhere to land, we're going to have to go with the top down, and they come flying in on his jetpack. I thought that was awesome. The fact that we got Slave One and Boba Fett, essentially more action from Slave One, apart from perhaps the... I'm not talking about Slave One from Attack of the Clones. Okay, so that is Attack of the Clones. I'm still waiting, and if somebody knows, I would like to know the reason why the paint scheme changed. Jango Fett's Slave One is Boba Fett's Slave One, but they ended up with two different paint schemes, and I'd like to know when the paint scheme changed. If it's in canon somewhere, somebody please email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. But the fact that we essentially got more Slave One and Boba Fett being the most bad A version of Boba Fett that we've ever seen in one 30-minute episode of The Mandalorian that we got in the last 45 years is pretty awesome. The return of Fennec Shan was also pretty awesome. The fact that they're going to have to team up with the Mandalorian to go and get the captured Grogu is also awesome. One of my favorite moments, though, a favorite moment, was when the Dark Troopers come down, also very Robert Rodriguez. The Dark Troopers come down, and they end up capturing Grogu, and they take him up to the Imperial ship. When Boba Fett gets in Slave One and begins to track him down, and the Mandalorian says, hey, no, we got to keep him safe. Don't shoot at him. And we get the shot of Slave One approaching the former Imperial ship before it jumps to light speed. I don't know what it was about that shot, except for just my love of vehicles, that I just thought was cool. It was a very natural thing to have happen among vehicles, if that makes sense. That's exactly what would have happened. Boba Fett would have been trying to fulfill his deal of getting the armor back. I love the explanation of the rationale about how Jango was a youngling. The armor was official and officially Boba Fett's. I thought that was all fantastic. The code chain, right? The code sequence was awesome. But that moment when Boba Fett is going to go and fulfill his part of the deal by rescuing the child and is told to stand down, and he ends up having to, well, I'm going to fly up to this Imperial ship anyways. That moment I just really, really stuck out to me. The biggest thing, though, is we're getting this mythology that I keep talking about that is so important to chew on. And the question now, with 2 episodes to go in this season, of we all kind of assume a Jedi is going to show up. Who's that Jedi going to be? All right, so let's get into that. Grogu on Tython. We get this amazing moment with Grogu sitting on that dome rock, doing his home Jedi thing with the blue Force glowy going up into the sky, right? A lot of people, especially Reylos out there, of which I'm partly one, even though I'm still a Reylo, even though I am totally fine with the way that The Last Jedi, The Rise of Skywalker played out. I still consider myself a Reylo. That kiss was beautiful. But a lot of people picked up on the butterflies that showed up. When Grogu is sitting there on that temple rock, on that dome. Those butterflies, and I pulled a bunch of comments from Reddit. It's often the best place to go and get fan comments. I love it. Those butterflies are a light side symbol. They also appear when Vader is meditating in one of his comic book series. They also appear, right, in the Baby Ben little cartoon series they put out of the little the balls rolling around, right? I didn't watch any of them because they were really done for young kids, but they're also there's also butterflies in that. One of the Redditors said this: the biggest takeaway is that there is blue force shooting into the sky. We're getting a Jedi at the end of the season, which is kind of what I've been predicting, said this individual. But I assumed that Grogu would have been kidnapped as a season finale cliffhanger. And actually, I take this back. These are my comments. This was my theory. I'm sorry, I got my notes here, and I didn't mark down who wrote what. This is my theory. Okay, so this was the biggest takeaway for me, was the blue glowing stuff shooting into the sky. We're going to get a Jedi. I assumed that Grogu would have been kidnapped as the season finale cliffhanger. Now I foresee his rescue and the arrival of a Jedi to either assist in the rescue or leave us wondering where Grogu will go, to train with a Jedi or to stay with the Mandalorian. Okay, so who's a Jedi going to be? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. I want to hear your opinions. But a lot of people, because of the butterflies, have been talking about, well, what about Ben Solo, pre-turning to the dark side? Timeline doesn't work. Ben Solo would only be 4 years old at the time of this. A lot of people have mentioned Ezra. That doesn't work for me because of that storyline that still is out there of Ahsoka and Sabine needing to find Ezra. To have him just show up in The Mandalorian because he heard the call would not make a lot of sense. There is some talk of Mace Windu surviving being heaved out the window on Coruscant in Revenge of the Sith. I'll get to more of that coming up. My bet, though, and this is a big one, is that it's Luke. And I'm not the only one to think this. So first we go to Dan Beto on Reddit wrote this: Luke should save him and have a Force talk with Grogu where he realizes Grogu's attachment to the Mandalorian and communicates that Grogu would rather walk the way of the Mandalore than be raised by the Jedi. Maybe Luke even abides by Grogu's wishes to help sever his connection with the Force. Interesting. BWP6229 wrote this: look at this as a writer, and I love doing this now that I've become an author. You're building to a season finale. The season has some of the biggest fan favorite characters in the whole of the Star Wars universe already in it, with Ahsoka and now Boba Fett. Your story is set in a time period when we know Luke Skywalker is actively searching out Jedi artifacts, Jedi treasures to help him make a new order. And at the same time, what we've seen and what we know of the Empire is that Moff Gideon, wants to use Grogu's blood in experiments regarding the Force. We've seen what appears to be a Proto-Snoke, who was Luke's main enemy in 7 and 8. So as a writer, with this info, you'd logically conclude that Luke would be the character you have show up and help our hero out. That would make the biggest impact for all fans. And again, going off with what I was saying, imagine that Ezra does show up. A huge portion of the audience would be like, who is this? Especially without Ahsoka, without an Ahsoka-like name drop we got in episode 3 of this season. Everyone would immediately know if it's Luke on screen. Okay. Now, there's also been quite a bit of chatter about the motif around Grogu that's very similar to Kylo Ren's theme and also a piece of Palpatine's theme. Okay. A lot of people have been speculating that this represents Gideon's Imperial faction as a precursor to the First Order. And as we've talked about, The Mandalorian Season 2 is supposed to begin to show us the impetus of the First Order, and I'm going to get in a little bit more into that in a second. A lot of people are saying that it's actually just Grogu's theme. It's played multiple times before, right after he tries to heal the Mando in Chapter 2, and when he stops the flamethrower in Chapter 8. So that could just be a part of Grogu's theme. Getting back to the First Order beginnings, I got a big old fat smile on my face when those, for lack of a better word, when Gideon's forces troop transports showed up, because they look like proto First Order troop transports. I love those. They're so basic, I just dig them. They look like little spaceship submarines with the conning tower on top. And these would be the ships, for those that are unfamiliar, don't know what I'm talking about. The First Order transports, these will be the ones that Rey tried to pull out of the sky that she mistakenly thought had Chewbacca in it in The Rise of Skywalker, and more specifically, the ships you see at the very start after the crawl heading to Jakku that dropped the First Order troopers off on Jakku at the beginning of that film prior to Kylo Ren's arrival. They seem like a step between a TIE Reaper and a First Order lander, and a little bit of the TIE Echelon, which, well, I'm not going to spoil anything. We'll just say that in Book 5 of the EMBARK series, I'm not even going to say anything. I'm just going to move on now. All right, so here's where we are. And here are the different threads. If I'm missing any threads from The Mandalorian, please, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Let me know what it is I'm missing. So we have the Bo-Katan, Moff Gideon, Darksaber potential return to the rightful heir restoring Mandalore. We've got that thread to pull on. We've got Moff Gideon, his midichlorian creation that he's trying to work on, which at this point I believe is to create Snoke. My speculation is that Dr. Pershing is going to extract enough midichlorians out of Grogu before he's saved to complete the creation of Snoke, while Palpatine is too damaged to still take control, and that perhaps the reason why we don't get a fully fleshed out Snoke and why he looks so decrepit is that they weren't able to get enough midichlorians to finish his form, and instead we get a fully force sensitive Snoke who visually looks wretched. Okay. We also have Ahsoka. Fans know of her search with Sabine to find Ezra. In The Mandalorian, we got her comment about Thrawn. Again, it's a safe bet that Ahsoka will show up and to connect. It's a safe bet that the Ahsoka show will connect that particular plot thread. Now we also have the fate of Grogu. Will he be trained? Will he be a foundling with the Mandalorian instead? Does that end up tying into the Darksaber and Bo-Katan? Does Grogu in Season 3 end up with the Mandalorian and Bo-Katan and the Darksaber on Mandalore? And again, if I'm missing anything here, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. I can envision a moment where the season finale of Season 2 is we get Grogu back, we have a Jedi, potentially Luke, who does what that Redditor said. And the cliffhanger is, what's going to happen now with Grogu? Is he going to continue to stay with the Mandalorian? Which makes the most sense when you consider the timeline moving forward and we haven't heard of Grogu. And he, at this point, wasn't a part of Luke Skywalker's training academy, right? Okay. And given Ahsoka's concern about the attachment that Grogu already has with the Mandalorian, then it makes a level of sense. It makes some sense that Grogu could end up with the Mandalorian and completing the story arc of returning the Darksaber to its rightful heir and restoring Mandalore, and thus he becomes a foundling of the Mandalorian, although I'm having a hard time envisioning a Grogu even grown up to Yoda size wearing Mandalorian armor, which is funny because my mom, I'm looking at it right now, my mom actually bought for me a really awesome pendant, a pin, of Grogu wearing Mandalorian armor. So, who knows? And lastly, and most importantly, what the heck is the Mandalorian going to find out if the Razor Crest is toast? That was a serious gut punch, man. You're probably wondering why I hadn't mentioned it yet, because I saved it for the last. Oh my gosh, they blew up the Razor Crest. That is the equivalent of blowing up the Millennium Falcon. What in the world did they do? All right, so we're going to land on this, and then I'm going to get to your listener feedback. So, he's got to get a new ship. There's no doubt about that. And I don't want to hear anybody saying they did it for merchandising. I don't care. It was a really interesting plot point that I think really raised the stakes for the Mandalorian and really ended up being a double gut punch of losing Grogu at the same time that he lost the Razor Crest. So, a couple of things. I have an article here. This goes back to September 17th from Screen Rant, where they talk about how they were expecting the Razor Crest to be destroyed. In order to elude TIE fighters and Star Destroyers, Din Djarin perhaps needs something small and nimble like an X-Wing, or loud and fast like the Millennium Falcon. The Razor Crest boasts a decent set of cannons, but it clearly is prone to damage. And the bulky frame offers up a tempting target for opponents. Switching ships in The Mandalorian makes tactical sense for the show's two heroes. After the events of Season 1, everyone knows what the Razor Crest looks like, from stormtroopers to bounty hunters and even Moff Gideon himself. Here's a possibility, and I'm going to toss a couple things out there. Because, I mean, either we're going to have an iconic ship that we're already aware of that the Mandalorian is going to inherit, even though I only have really one idea of what that ship can be, and I'll present that here in a second, or we get a brand new ship. There has been some rumors going around that dropped this week that we're going to be seeing Naboo in Season 3 of The Mandalorian. We know that the Razor Crest was pre-Empire Clone Wars tech, right? It's got that look of a former Republic gunship, which would be awesome, by the way. To see the Mando flying around in a Republic gunship and to see another live-action version of that would be rad. Now, there's another possibility here, too. I know that we've been getting rumors of a Boba Fett TV show, and maybe we will, but somebody had posted on Reddit that they're kind of scared about Boba being back, in as much as they may just end up killing him off. Mandalorian loses his ship in the same episode that Slave One shows up. If Boba Fett ends up dying, then the Mandalorian gets Slave One by the finale. Okay? Now, this brings up another interesting element, and this is going way out there. There's been a lot of talk about Mace Windu, played by Samuel L. Jackson, returning to the Star Wars universe. We have a nasty habit of bringing back characters that we thought were dead that weren't. Okay, so Palpatine, Darth Maul, most respectively. So, we know that Boba Fett's got a beef with Mace Windu. What if it's Mace Windu that ends up showing up as the Jedi who answers the call of Grogu? What if it was Mace Windu who went and hid Grogu in the first place? What if that ends up in a showdown between Boba Fett and Mace Windu, in which Boba Fett ends up getting taken out by Mace Windu, and therefore the Mandalorian inherits Slave One? It's almost too easy. But it would make a bit of sense. You're going to need to do some storytelling because we're kind of, at least in my mind, we're looking at Boba Fett now as kind of a sympathetic character. So we would need a turn of events to turn Boba Fett into a bad guy again, the anti-hero, in order, I think, for the fans to accept that Mace Windu kills him after him benefiting the Mandalorian. What do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
And at the 1 hour mark, let's dive into listener feedback. We start off with friend of the show, Purple Flower. Thank you for answering my question last week. Now a moment of silence for the Razor Crest. Man, I never thought I would get sentimental for a ship. Right? Thank you, Purple Flower. Miranda writes, also friend. You're all friends of the show, just so you guys all know that. I can sum up yesterday's episode in one word. Possibilities, infinite, unlimited, abundance of possibilities. I believe that was in reference to Chapter 13 with Ahsoka, by the way. JW says this. Rosario looked as if she'd been training to be Ahsoka for years. She got down all the moves and the mannerisms perfect. They weren't exactly accurate with her costume. Her Leiku were not long enough and didn't have the right coloring on her face markings. But who cares? I disagree. I agree the Leiku weren't long enough. And I mentioned the reason why earlier in the show. But her face markings, again, we're translating from animation to live action, so I'm always going to default to live action. So I would go so far as to say the face colorings in the animated shows aren't right. But again, the most relevant comment that JW made was, who cares? She did amazing. As for Grogu, I love the name. I just want to hear more about his backstory now. Yes, I do too. Knowing he was at the Jedi Temple during Order 66 makes me wonder where he was and who he was with. I do as well. Good to hear from you, JW. It's been a long time since you've written, and I'm glad you're still listening. All right. Friend of the show, Disney Desi, says, I hope that Luke does not come for Grogu if he reaches out through the Force. We saw that happen. We saw what happened to his temple and all his students, and I don't want that to happen to Grogu. He needs to stay with Daddy Din. And again, I think that he's going to end up doing that. I think that his connection is too strong to the Mandalorian, so we'll see. I just love the fact that we've got all this stuff to chew on, right? All right. Edwin from the Lowdown Show says this. There are some casual fans that believe Maul can show up in The Mandalorian. Nope, he's dead as a doornail. But in Rebels, he was killed by Obi-Wan on Tatooine. Yes, he was. Have you heard anything about Maul being still alive? No, I haven't. He's dead as a doornail. I can still see how it can get confusing if they don't have more info on the timelines with the TV, movies, and animated shows, if they didn't watch all of them. Just something I observe and listen to with other reviewers. Edwin, I mentioned that last week, but they're very careful when it comes to the specific content to make sure that they ease the fans into it. So even fans that never knew of Ahsoka before or had watched any of the ancillary material of Ahsoka, the fact that it's called The Jedi gives you everything you need to know about that character right out of the gate. And the fact she's looking for Thrawn. And now people can go back, as demonstrated with the streaming numbers for Disney Plus, and watch all the other material to get themselves up to speed. All right, friend of the show, Howard, says this. I wasn't sure how I felt about Rosario Dawson playing Ahsoka because the voice just wasn't the same as Ashley Eckstein. I, like many, had grown accustomed to hearing her voice and associating it with the character. I guess the hang-up is, unlike other characters that were first introduced as live action, you expect that they end up getting someone else to do the voice for a cartoon that follows, just like how James Taylor does the voice for Obi-Wan while Ewan McGregor and Alec Guinness both played him in live action. I'm now cool with it. Rosario Dawson did a wonderful job portraying Ahsoka. I want to see more of her as Ahsoka. Here's to hoping for that spinoff. Now that it's December, I hope you and your family have a Merry Christmas. Thank you, Howard. I hope you do too, and I always appreciate your comments. All right, let's see. Shlomo, friend of the show, said this, quoting me from last week. I'm a bit of a Star Wars apologist. I love everything about it. But there isn't any part that I don't love in some way, shape, or form. He says, really, John? Misa want to know in what shape or form you love Jar Jar Binks. I dig Jar Jar Binks, man. Jar Jar Binks is there for children. Children love Jar Jar Binks. He wasn't there for adults. And I get it. I get it. I know people don't like the voice, and even I was like, why is he talking that way? That being said, I never had an issue with Jar Jar. He was always there for kids, and Star Wars is for kids after all. I can't personally make it through the Phantom Menace without believing that Jar Jar is in fact Darth Plagueis the Wise. I once saw a fan edit that changes his voice to a very deep tone that speaks in an alien language, and it adds subtitles that changes dialogue. It's the best cut of the film I've seen. I'm with you on loving nearly every part of Star Wars. I can even stomach Ewoks, but I can't love Jar Jar. That's okay, right? You don't have to like all of it. What fun is that? Jen G says this. Now, while I like Ahsoka, I wasn't screaming and crying when I saw her, as I've seen others doing. I was more excited at Thrawn's name as I read the book way back that Timothy Zahn created when he created Thrawn. The episode was great, and I could tell Rosario was definitely mimicking animated Ahsoka very well on all aspects. I would gladly watch her own series. I loved Rebels, and I agree. I would love to see Hera. Gonna disagree a bit with you, as I love season 1 of The Mandalorian just as much. But in all fairness to you, you've always stated you like the Jedi lore type stuff in your Star Wars. I like that as well, but season 1 was still fantastic to me. And it was for me too, don't misunderstand. Again, you gotta just be honest. I'm liking season 2 more than season 1. But I don't know, I've watched every single episode of season 1 at least 5 or 6 times. So, I just want it all. I do too. Did anybody else get Kill Bill vibes when Ahsoka and the other woman on the walkway bridge met and fought? It hit me hard. I may be in the minority, but I wouldn't be okay if Mando and Grogu were ever separated. To me, there is no one without the other. Also, they could have done better than Grogu for the child's name. It will take a while to sit with me if it ever does, but I'm excited for the future of the series. Great episode, John. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And it's good to hear from you, Jen G. Friend of the show, Brian Martin, presents an old question, but since we were talking about The Rise of Skywalker, and it's been 1 year since its release, he posted an article here from Jedi Temple Archives. This was back from last year, where somebody was pitching a fit about the line from the trailer, right? Why does Poe seem surprised that stormtroopers have jets when, according to the comic, he saw them before? In the comic, Poe actually observes how the First Order stormtroopers use jetpacks, and the fact the First Order used jetpacks even before The Force Awakens begs the question, how Finn, a stormtrooper back then, never heard of these things? Here's a simple answer. Probably not going to like it. They did it for the movie. Look, when I saw it, I was unaware that they had tackled this particular issue. When I saw the trailer for the first time and they did the, they fly now, they fly now, they fly now. Okay. I thought it was a funny line. I figured it's probably been covered at some point in canon, but in my mind I went, well, we know Mandalorian fly. We know they have jetpacks, but we hadn't seen First Order troopers using jetpacks yet until The Rise of Skywalker. So perhaps Finn just never saw First Order troopers wearing jetpacks. Now, you say the comic mentions it. Okay, but I always go with the movies being canon first before comics or books. Doesn't take me out of the film. It was a line written for the movie. And again, if we're going to start nitpicking down to minutia like that based off of particular issues of comic books versus movies, then you might as well just toss all of your Star Wars content away, because not a single anything ever gets any of it perfectly right. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I just end up making up my own headcanon and I move on. Lastly, we got a comment here from Find Mortis. I've watched episode 13 6 times, and I scream cry from all the joy. There was even a mysterious little owl in the tree near Ahsoka in the forest when Din found her. Gee, I wonder who that little sweetie was. Yep, it was the it's Khan something, and I have to go look it up. I don't want to pause the show, but that owl is connected to Ahsoka and has been throughout the animated series, and it was cool to go and see it there as well. All right, that's it. That wraps up the show this week. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next week as we review Chapter 15. Look, I'm getting the episode numbers right because I got them wrong last week, and I felt stupid. I do a Star Wars podcast, and I did something wrong. I tried to fix it, but can't fix the episode. Thank you so much for checking the show out. As always, if you want to support My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. I would ask that you would please go and pick up your preferred version of ebook, paperback, or audiobook of the EMBARK trilogy, available now on Amazon and mynerdworld.net. This is a science fiction space opera epic for all ages, 11 to 80 or 90. Everybody seems to enjoy them. More stories on the way. As a matter of fact, as it stands right now, there will be double the amount of EMBARK stories available next year. I'm pushing back the release date on Gon Corbin and the Asteroid of Misfortune, which is book 4. That will be out in early January. I'm waiting for the proofread to come back, but I want to be able to spend a little time with it. And since the holidays, since Christmas is almost here, I figured I'm going to wait until January. But the plan is to release a new book in the series January, February, March, and April next year. If you are not a part of the newsletter yet, which is free and you will not get any spam, go to mynerdworld.net, pop-up window will come up, and give me your email address. You can get exclusive content, exclusive discounts. Also, books available to only individuals, including an art book for EMBARK that I'm putting together right now that will be available to only subscribers of the newsletter. Go to mynerdworld.net and sign up. Just give me your email address. But again, pick up a copy of the book, ebook, paperback, or audiobook, produced and narrated by me. That's how you can support the show. I wrote these stories because of my love of Star Wars, science fiction, and space opera, and all the details and storylines are available at Amazon. Search for EMBARK. And Jon Justice, you'll find it there. Have yourself a fantastic week. An early Merry Christmas to you. And I'll talk to you again. We'll be discussing all the news of the week and Chapter 15 of The Mandalorian.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.